April 23, 1771, some people were sitting around reading news articles published by the Essex Gazette. One article was dedicated to the punishment of a man named William Carlisle. He'd been found guilty of using counterfeit money in the town of Newport, Massachusetts. The newspaper said he was sentenced to 1 hour in the pillory, during which time both his cheeks were branded with the letter R. That's because he'd been accused of being a rogue. If that wasn't bad enough, they sliced off both his ears. Needless to say, they were tough on crime back in those days. We found this information in a series of notes and news clippings in something called the Olden Times series, some strange and curious punishments. Most of the crimes and the punishments discussed had taken place in Boston and Salem, Massachusetts. It makes for interesting reading. Someone who'd written a book that had upset the authorities were forced to literally eat his own words. That meant the book he was written was pulled apart and then force-fed to the hapless man. He had to eat the pages until the authorities thought if he ate more, he'd die. For worse crimes, there were worse measures. Pirates just about always went to the gallows, although those people who'd been forced to work on pirate ships got off lightly. Robberies also usually meant execution, as did murder, or in one case an attempted murder of a woman by her husband. Petty thievery seems usually resulted in the accused being whipped. In another case, a man accused of being a bad husband was paraded through town and shouted at by mobs. As for unruly kids in the olden days America, sometimes teachers would make them put walnuts in their mouths so they were unable to speak. Other kids were forced to walk around all day carrying a heavy stone. One teacher had something called the Mansion of Misery, which was a space he'd drawn with chalk on the floor where naughty kids had to stand for hours, perfectly still. If they moved, they might take a beating with his paddle. Just so we could better understand the climate of the times, here are some more punishments we found. A woman who'd been fighting for women's rights was accused of upsetting the elders. For that, her tongue was literally tied. Another person was tied neck and heels and thrown into a pond. That's just brutal. One person got off lucky and was only tied to a tree and chastised. The person who was sentenced for having their tongue bored with a hot iron wasn't so fortunate. Quite a few folks were forced to walk on the treadmill, which was a bit like a step machine in the gym except you couldn't get off. Perhaps the most bizarre punishment we found in this booklet was someone being sewed up in bedclothes and thrashed. In view of that, ear cropping wasn't exactly a big thing back then. There were a whole host of cruel and unusual punishments in what was called the New World. But you might be wondering, because they had so many strange punishments, what made the judge choose a certain one? Well, execution was reserved for the worst punishments, and whipping was very common indeed. When it came to ear cropping and branding, the onus was on making the person live the rest of their lives in shame. Forevermore, when they walked around, people knew they'd committed a crime. With branding, the person wore a letter that represented the particular crime. So if they were a cheat or adulterer, as people would say back then, they were branded with an A. If they were a blasphemer, they got a B. Drunks, likely drunks who caused trouble, would forevermore wear a D. Thieves got a T, and people accused of forgery got an F. So then, why take the person's ear? Well, it's complicated. Let's now visit England and see why it happened there. Take, for instance, the story of a man named Thomas Berry. He was what was called an almoner. This was a person of the church who did the nice thing of giving alms to the poor. It was a good job to have, but it didn't prevent a person from getting into trouble. Berry was around during the reign of King Henry VIII, close to the end of Henry's life. Berry started saying he'd heard the king was already dead. He thought he had reliable sources, so he went about telling people. Trouble was, Henry wasn't dead. Saying the king is dead was a huge crime back then, and one that would usually result in execution since it was an act of treason. Berry wasn't sentenced to death, but he was sentenced to standing in the pillory all day long while people in the market square stood around him, calling him treasonous while throwing rotten vegetables at him. If that wasn't bad enough, his ears were nailed to the wood. As the sun went down that day, the authorities cut off his ears and let him out of the pillory. Some sources say he died of shock then and there, but other sources say he lived on. This was one form of cropping. They always intended to take off his ears, but worse, the punishment was intended for the person to struggle in the pillory while dealing with a sometimes hostile mob, and therefore rip their own ears off. It was also a symbolic punishment in this case, since Berry had spread rumors which had entered other people's heads through their ears. Then there was William Prynne. In the 17th century, he was well known for writing a lot of pamphlets that delineated his religious beliefs. He was quite the Puritan and detested all forms of decadence, including drinking booze, which was as common as drinking water in his native England. He even hated acting, which put him on the wrong side of King Charles I. Charlie's wife was a big old fan of the theater. To cut a long story short, Prynne bugged a lot of people, and a lot of powerful people. He ended up in prison, but even while in the cell, he managed to troll the people he didn't like. That's why in 1633 he had SL branded on both cheeks, which stood for seditious libel. They also sliced off both his ears. Even though he walked with marks of shame, King Charles II took a liking to him and he spent the latter part of his life as a free man. We found quite a few cases of people accused of libel in England who were given a hefty prison sentence to be served without a pair of ears. Believe it or not, England had a kind of three strikes law long before it was introduced in the USA. Under Henry VIII, the Vagabonds Act of 1530 came into existence. It's said to be one of the first poor laws, a kind of welfare, because it made sure that beggars could have a license to beg if they applied for one. This was better than before because prior to that they might just have been punished. The law, however, was tough on vagrants, people accused of just not wanting to work rather than being disabled or old. Under this new law, if people were arrested for vagrancy, the first time they were put in the stocks for 3 days. But if they were caught again, they had their ears shorn off. If they were struck out a third time, they were executed. So it was during the 16th and 17th centuries in Britain that ear cropping was sometimes the go-to punishment for sedition, which basically means saying things that might make people want to rebel against the authorities, mainly the church and the monarchy. Ear cropping didn't actually happen too often, but there are plenty of reliable resources that stated it definitely did happen. Here's what a British chronicler wrote after he watched a person having his ears cropped. The executioner cut off his ears deep and close, with much effusion of blood, an artery being cut. The further we looked into this, we found that in some countries other body parts might have been removed. When nuns rebelled in the 6th century at a French Benedictine monastery, many of them had their noses removed. It happened a bit later to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II. After that, he wore a golden prosthesis. Apparently, this kind of mutilation was common in Byzantine culture, as it was in parts of East Asia. In ancient Egypt, there was something called the Great Harem Conspiracy. A harem had conspired to bring down the ruler Pharaoh Ramses III. That resulted in a few people losing not only their noses but also their ears. Scholars sometimes disagree about the translation of the version of events, but it seems quite a few conspirators were executed, others were forced to take their own lives. Some lost their nose and ears, and at least one was given a severe verbal warning. In fact, we found this kind of thing happened all over the place back in the day. When the great Danish king, King Canute, reigned over not only Denmark but England and Norway, he introduced some new laws. This is how one of them went. A woman who commits adultery with another man whilst her husband is still alive and is found out shall suffer public disgrace, and her husband will have all her property, and she will lose her nose and ears. In various parts of the world, at some point in time, the crime of adultery could have led to losing a nose or ears. In some cases, the part of the body that came off was a man's penis, and other times a person's eyes could be gouged out. But let's stick with the ears for now and hear more about ear cropping in North America. The winter of 1609 to 1610 was a bad time in Virginia colony. In fact, it was called the starving time. A lot of people literally had nothing to eat. This is how one person described it. Having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, and mice. Some people also apparently ate shoe leather and rotten flesh from corpses they dug up. It wasn't a nice scene at all. You can imagine these folks weren't exactly soft on crime. If people were found stealing food during the starving time, it was very likely they'd be punished in a cruel and unusual way. If it was just petty theft, they might have had something called a bodkin inserted in their tongue. This device kind of looked like an arrowhead or a spike. That wasn't close to the worst that could happen. In 1623, in Virginia, a guy named Captain Richard Quails was sent to the pillory, although it's not exactly clear why. This is what was written about the nature of his punishment. He should be set upon the pillory with his ears nailed thereto. They either be cut off or redeemed by paying the fine of 100 pounds sterling. Fast forward to 1755 and a person might have picked up the Maryland Gazette. On one particular day, they'd have read that an African-American woman had been flogged, but also had her ears cropped close. Around the same time, someone might have read the Statutes at Large of Pennsylvania. This was what the law said about counterfeiting. Such person or persons shall be sentenced to the pillory, and to have both his or her ears cut off and nailed to the pillory, and to be publicly whipped on his or her bare back with 31 lashes well laid on. Horse thieves received a similar punishment, but they also might have been branded with the letters HT. In 1782, a guy named Bryce McWhimney of Bedford County, Pennsylvania lost his ears after stealing a horse, but it seems he didn't get the brand treatment. He did get 39 lashes though. In 1790 in Tennessee, two guys named John Wilson and Joseph Folsom were accused of horse stealing. Their punishment was to be confined in the public pillory for the space of 1 hour, and that each of them have both their ears nailed to the pillory and severed from their heads. In 1794, a slave from Virginia was accused of stealing a hog from the man who enslaved him. He had one of his ears nailed to the pillory, and after an hour it was cut off. Then his other ear was nailed to the pillory, and that too was cut off after an hour. The New England Puritans created something called the Blue Laws, likely called that because they were written on blue paper. The laws related to being impious, which could mean a lot of things. Drinking too much or shopping on a Sunday, or even showing someone too much affection could land a person in trouble. It was normal in New England but seen as backward in some other places. A woman could even have been found guilty of the excessive wearing of lace, because that could get men aroused. Back then, men in the town of New Haven were forced to wear a hat on Saturday and shave off all the hair that remained under the brim of the hat. If they didn't have a hat, they had to wear half a pumpkin shell. This is why they were sometimes called pumpkinheads. According to Reverend Samuel Peters in his General History of Connecticut, one of the reasons why they had to cut their hair was such persons have lost their ears for heresy and other wickedness cannot conceal the misfortune and disgrace. Hearing that, you have to wonder just how common ear cropping was. As far as we can see, branding and ear cropping didn't completely die out in the US until around 1850, and much of the time, it was slaves who were victims of the punishment. Louisiana, for instance, had something called the Black Code or Code Noir. This made it possible for slave owners to brand or crop the ears of slaves who had run away. It seems these days the only victims of such barbarity are some family pets. Now you need to watch The Catherine Wheel, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind, or have a look at this.